March 24, 1603. The halls of Whitehall Palace lay wrapped in an eerie stillness as the first grey light of dawn crept through ancient windows, in a bedchamber thick with the scent of decay and lavender meant to disguise it. Europe's most powerful woman had just drawn her final breath. What the royal physicians were about to witness would be so deeply disturbing that some historians believe the truth was deliberately buried in official records for over 4 centuries. This isn't speculation. This is documented history, pieced together from diplomatic correspondence, court records, and medical accounts that paint a portrait of horror hiding behind the golden mask of majesty. Because Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, the woman who defined an age, died with secrets literally embedded in her flesh. Secrets so grotesque that even her closest advisors worked to conceal them from history itself. The nightmare didn't begin with her death. It started on a cold October night in 1562 when 29-year-old Elizabeth contracted smallpox, one of the most feared killers of the Tudor age. Court records describe her falling desperately ill, her fever so intense that physicians prepared her counsel for the worst. Smallpox murdered roughly 30% of those it touched, and those who survived often bore its signature across their faces for life. Deep pockmarks and scarring that marked them forever. Spanish Ambassador Alvaro de la Cuadra wrote in coded dispatches that Elizabeth would remain hidden from view for months following her recovery, her face reportedly ravaged by disfigurement, yet curiously, another official court report claimed she emerged nearly untouched, her skin bearing barely a mark. These violently conflicting accounts weren't mistakes or exaggerations. They were the first cracks in a carefully constructed lie, a deception that would grow more elaborate and more toxic with each passing year. After 1562, something changed in Elizabeth's court records reveal unprecedented orders for Venetian ceruse, a white lead-based cosmetic paste that promised to restore flawless pale skin. But this wasn't vanity in any ordinary sense. This was desperation dressed in powder and paint. That ceruse was applied daily, sometimes left on for days at a time, allowing toxic lead to seep deep into her pores, into her bloodstream, into the very fabric of her being. She paired this with a lip stain made from cinnabar, a mercury-rich mineral that gave her that distinctive blood-red mouth that became her signature. Mercury absorbs rapidly through the delicate tissue of the lips, making every application a dose of poison. The removal process was even worse, a caustic mixture of eggshells, alum, and more mercury, scrubbed across already damaged skin, doubling her daily exposure to substances that were slowly, methodically destroying her from the inside out. By the 1570s, Venetian ambassadors began noting alarming changes in their confidential reports back to the Doge. The Queen's teeth, once white, had turned yellow, then black. One by one, they began to rot in her mouth, a pattern modern medical experts recognize immediately as consistent with chronic mercury poisoning. But the transformation was only beginning, and what witnesses would see in the decades to come would be far worse than anyone could have imagined. If you're fascinated by the dark truths history tried to bury, please hit that like button and subscribe. These stories need to be told, and your support helps us keep uncovering the secrets that powerful figures wanted to remain hidden forever. Comment below where you're watching from, because together we're building a community that refuses to let history's darkest chapters be forgotten. In 1599, something happened that should never have been seen. Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, accidentally entered the Queen's private chambers before she had applied her daily armor of cosmetics and wigs. What he witnessed left him so shaken that his description was initially dismissed by historians as political slander. Nothing more than a rival trying to damage the Queen's reputation. But Essex described a woman who was barely recognizable as human, completely bald, her scalp visible beneath thin wisps of remaining hair, her skin so ravaged and discolored that she looked decades older than her 66 years. Court records from this same period show massive orders for elaborate wigs and reveal careful notes from ladies-in-waiting phrased with delicate language to avoid giving offense, confirming that the Queen had indeed lost all of her hair. The toxins coursing through her system had claimed even that final vanity. The psychological deterioration was equally horrifying. Spanish diplomats in the 1590s reported increasingly erratic behavior. Episodes where Elizabeth would stare at walls for hours without speaking, lost in some internal darkness. She experienced violent mood swings, sudden rages followed by deep melancholy. Modern toxicologists examining these historical accounts recognize the symptoms immediately. Neurological damage from prolonged heavy metal poisoning, the brain itself slowly poisoned by the very substances she used to maintain her image. And in her final weeks, the cruelest irony of all descended upon her. Elizabeth I, famous for her golden speeches, the Queen who had rallied her troops at Tilbury with words that rang through history, lost the ability to speak. Robert Carey's official account preserved in the National Archives describes how the once eloquent monarch was reduced to desperate gestures, drawing an invisible crown around her head with trembling fingers to indicate that James VI of Scotland should succeed her. Medical historians note that the loss of speech is a documented symptom of advanced mercury poisoning. As the toxins interfere with the nervous system controlling the vocal muscles, she had been silenced by her own vanity, by the very tools she had used to maintain her power. Her final days were a horror show of stubbornness and decay. Elizabeth Southwell, one of her ladies-in-waiting, recorded that the Queen stood in her chamber for 15 hours without assistance, refusing to lie down because she feared that once she surrendered to rest, she would never rise again. When exhaustion finally claimed her and she collapsed, servants who had anticipated this moment had already prepared cushions across the floor to break her fall. She remained there, speechless and broken, for 4 days before being moved to her bed, and then came her final, desperate request. She insisted her body not be disemboweled after death, breaking with royal tradition that required this step for preservation. Elizabeth knew what lay inside her, knew what an examination would reveal, but Robert Cecil, one of her chief counselors, ignored her wishes. The standard embalming procedure was ordered, and the truth she had fought so hard to hide was laid bare before the royal physicians. The embalming itself was unusually extensive. Elizabeth's body was treated with preservative fluids and guarded at Whitehall Palace for 3 weeks before burial, a length of time that raised eyebrows even then. Modern forensic experts suggest this meticulous preservation, combined with her lead-lined coffin, may have created ideal conditions for retaining evidence of toxic exposure for centuries to come. At her funeral, mourners were presented with an elaborate wooden effigy atop her coffin, dressed in full parliamentary robes with crown and scepter, so lifelike it astonished those who viewed it. That carefully crafted illusion presented a queen in perfect health, because those who arranged the funeral knew the actual corpse was too damaged, too horrifying, for public display. And then came the most shocking claim of all. Elizabeth Southwell reported that days after the funeral, the Queen's body, saturated with toxic vapors from decades of poisoning, exploded within the lead coffin. She described a loud crack as internal pressure shattered the wood, lead and cloth wrappings. While Southwell later became a less reliable source, modern forensic studies confirm that bodies containing extraordinarily high levels of lead and mercury can produce unusual gas, build up during decomposition, sometimes causing dramatic ruptures. Since 1606, when King James I moved her remains to the Lady Chapel at Westminster Abbey, Elizabeth's coffin has never been opened. The only glimpse inside came during Victorian-era explorations when historians discovered a coffin bearing a carved Tudor rose, the initials ER, and the year 1603. The mystery of what her remains truly reveal has remained sealed for over 400 years. The irony is almost unbearable. The very measures taken to honor her in death may have safeguarded the secrets she desperately tried to hide in life. Until that tomb is opened, we can only piece together the horror from fragments of truth that survived the centuries. Perhaps the greatest secret isn't what ended Elizabeth's life, but what her story reveals about the price of power and the deadly cost of maintaining an illusion that the world demands you uphold, even as it slowly kills you from within.